inevitable and necessary. And what I'd like to do is just spend a few more minutes to explore what some of those transitions might look like. The important thing is that political and regulatory choices are going to be very important, and that what we do just in the very short term is also pivotal. So how can all this be achieved? And as I said, government policy is going to be important. Government policy at the national level and at the international level is going to be necessary to bring about the changes that we must see. But there isn't an endless list of things to do. In fact, we can really focus on 5 key things. The first is about more efficient use of the energy. The second is about increasing our use of renewable and nuclear energy, for instance, biomass here in Brazil. The third is about linking carbon capture and storage with our use of fossil fuels to reduce emissions there. The fourth is about containment, destruction or reduced usage of other greenhouse gases. So this is things like the HFCs and sulfur hexafluoride and things like that. And of course, managing land use, forestry and land use change around the world. These are the 5 critical things that we need to do in the coming decades. And we need to do it by looking back at the energy picture that I showed you earlier on and thinking about the key sectors that exist in it today. Power generation, industry manufacturing, mobility, buildings, and agriculture and land use. And let me focus, I'm not going to focus today on agriculture and land use. That's not my area of expertise. I'm going to focus more on the energy sector. And think about what is the pathway forward? How do we structure a policy environment to really start to tackle this? And the first thing we must look at is that a number of new technologies are going to come into the energy mix. And we have to ensure that they come in quickly, and we have to encourage their development. And we do that by looking at a technology cost curve. So technologies typically start out, they come in at quite an expensive level, and as they're demonstrated and deployed, the cost comes down, and they become mainstream technologies, eventually competing with alternative products. But they may need some benefit to deployment. There are key steps along the way. We need to encourage the discovery and development. Particularly in the energy sector, we need to show that these technologies work at large scale. We need to demonstrate them at large scale. And then we need to make sure that we have deployment mechanisms, such as a CO2 price, to ensure that they move in through our economy. And so if we start to think about the big sectors that are involved and the technology pathways that are necessary, a policy matrix emerges. And as governments, we need to think about all of the parts of this policy matrix to ensure that we get change in our energy system. And this isn't a comprehensive list, this is just some examples of the types of policy changes that are necessary. Now let me focus on one in particular that's quite close to Shell and to the oil and gas industry. That's carbon capture and storage. This is a technology where we take CO2 from the use of fossil fuels, we purify it, and we store it, we pump it back underground into old oil and gas reservoirs, into saline aquifers, into a number of geological structures where we can safely store it for the very long term. And this is a set of technologies that we have available in the oil and gas industry today. But of course, we require the financial incentive through a CO2 price to deploy it. And Shell has a portfolio of CCS projects around the world which we're starting to look at and starting to implement. But the scale of the challenge for implementing this is very large. As I said before, today we're close to 390 parts per million, and we need to make sure that we plateau at around 450 parts per million. Just from coal generation alone, just in China, just from the current generation of power stations, if they run for 50 years without carbon capture and storage, they alone will add 15 parts per million of CO2 to the atmosphere. That's without all of the other things going on in the world. And similarly, we calculated from our scenarios that every year we delay this technology, and this is true of other technologies as well, every year we delay new nuclear, every year we delay more renewables, we're adding 1 ppm to the atmosphere, so that the final level, instead of being 450 ppm, will be 451 or 452, and so on, the more we delay these technologies. This just gives you an idea of how carbon capture and storage might look in practice. This is a picture which shows some of the activities just starting to happen in Canada today. And we might even see carbon capture and storage be part of an evolving evolution in transport, for instance. So today in transport, it's very much focused on oil going into cars. And in countries like Brazil, we've expanded that out to include biomass. This is just the beginning of the transport revolution. We can see new technologies coming in to make synthetic fuels. We might see electric cars coming in, but we need to source that electricity. We might see hydrogen coming into the mix, but again we need to source that hydrogen. And eventually we start to see a very complex picture arising, which includes technologies like carbon capture and storage. So even in the transport sector, which is evolving over the coming decades, these are important technologies. In Europe, there's been a big step forward in encouraging this technology through money on the table to help with the demonstration program and through the deployment mechanism through the European emissions trading system. And we need to find ways of replicating these types of mechanisms in other countries around the world. So let me finish on the UNFCCC, because this isn't just a national story, it's an international story as well. And we know that very demanding reductions are called for, something like 50% by 2050 relative to 1990. And this means that by 2050, in a global population of 9 billion, we get 2 tons of carbon each, 2 tons of CO2. Today in the USA, emissions are around 20 tons of CO2. In Europe, around 10 tons of CO2. Even in countries like China, already at nearly 5 tons of CO2 per person. And we have to think about what is a structure of an international deal that might actually bring about the necessary changes. I think what we need to think about is what we've called here the global abatement curve, which looks at the range of options available and the carbon price necessary to get them to happen. There's 2 types of projects here, really.